Thank you so much for joining us on the Reasonable Faith Podcast with Dr. William Lane Craig. Kevin Harris in the studio with Dr. Craig. Bill, on my reading list is Stephen Hawking's new book. I know that you read it because you've commented on it. Let's sum it up a little bit on this podcast.
Right. The people who are marketing this book were very clever because they created a lot of controversy and a lot of stir before it was ever released by saying that Hawking and Mladenov's new book had eliminated God, and it looked like it was taking a stronger stance than Hawking's earlier book, A Brief History of Time. In fact, when you read it, I think it was all hype.
Well, it was, because I did see that a lot. Hawking dispels God, and so you had a lot of interesting headlines like that.
Exactly. But in fact, the book really doesn't take a harder position than he took in A Brief History of Time, nor does it offer any new scientific theories or evidence that wasn't mentioned in The Brief History of Time. It's basically a recapitulation of his no-boundary proposal that he developed with James Hartle at UCSB for avoiding the initial cosmological singularity. And then he propounds a multiverse theory, a many worlds view, in order to get rid of the fine-tuning.
So he's kind of bought into the multiverse.
Yes, but again, that's not really anything new in this book. So in terms of the scientific material in the book, it's pretty much a rehash of earlier stuff.
We should probably say the name of the book. It's
The Grand Design by Stephen Hawking and his co-author Leonard Mladenov from Caltech.
So it's a book talking about intelligent design, is that right?
The book's title is a misnomer. The purpose of the book is to show that there's no grand design, that in fact everything is simply explained by the laws of nature without any sort of grand design behind it all. So the title is misleading, I guess.
Again, because you mentioned this boundaryless universe that he proposes, where if you were to reduce the universe backwards in time down, rather than come to a point, it would kind of come to a curve.
Right.
Kind of like a badminton birdie.
That's right.
Why is that a more appealing model to him? It seems to, what's the difference between a cone and a point,
Well, the difference would be that the cone has an edge to that geometrical structure, whereas the badminton birdie doesn't have an edge. You can go right on through the South Pole and up the other side. And so as a result, the laws of physics don't break down anywhere in the model. But I think, as you're sensing, the model, in fact, involves an absolute beginning to time in the universe just as much as the standard model does. It just doesn't begin at a point of infinite density, space-time curvature, temperature, and so forth. The South Pole that is featured in the model is like any other point in space-time rather than being a singular point. But it's still the beginning of the universe. And I did think that one of the most interesting features of this book that was new is the interpretation that they lend to the Hartle-Hawking no-boundary proposal. Namely, they treat the South Pole in the model as the beginning of time, and the lines of latitude that would go north from the South Pole up the structure, they treat those as a measure of time, of the duration of the universe, so that the universe and time itself has a beginning at the South Pole in the model, which is, of course, the second premise of the Kalam cosmological argument, that the universe began to exist. So rather than present this imaginary time regime that's pictured at the beginning of the model as timeless or just existing in a sort of tenseless way, they present this in the grand design as the absolute beginning of time. And Hawking says this has the advantage of avoiding the otherwise awkward question, what was there before the beginning? Because on this model, time begins at the South Pole, and therefore there is no before, and therefore it's meaningless to ask what was there before the Big Bang. Now, what he doesn't seem to appreciate is that while that does effectively remove that question, the standard model with the singularity does exactly the same thing. It is meaningless to ask what took place before the singularity because the singularity represents the boundary point of space and time, and therefore it's meaningless to ask what there was before. So the theist who believes that God created the universe will say, with respect at least to physical time, that while God is causally prior to the universe, he's not temporally prior to the universe. Traditionally, theologians have interpreted God to be timeless, and therefore he would not exist temporally prior or chronologically prior to the beginning. The answer to the question, what was there before the Big Bang in a chronological sense, is nothing. There wasn't anything. But God is causally prior to the Big Bang, but not temporally prior.
Okay.
So I found the book actually to be very supportive of theism and of natural theology, at least with respect to the cosmological argument.
The Kalam in particular, then. Mm-hmm. Back to these diagrams of the Big Bang that we often see on science shows and even in your work. It's difficult sometimes, Bill, to depict the Big Bang because when you show the lines of time going upward and things like this and have a south pole and things like this, it's as if you're looking at it from the outside. You're looking at it from a distance, and there was no distance. The only way you could observe the Big Bang would be from the inside as it went out because there was no time and space beyond it. And so sometimes those models can be confusing.
Very, very misleading.
An explosion in space rather than an explosion of space.
Right. Even the word Big Bang suggests the image of this super dense pellet existing in this big empty space, empty container of space, which then blew up. And that's not the model. It's much more radical than that. As you say, it cannot be visualized from the outside because there is no outside.
That's not to say that we can't diagram it. We just have to keep in mind with these diagrams, sometimes the perspective can be kind of deceiving.
Right. In the diagrams that we draw, one of the spatial dimensions is suppressed. You have to eliminate it and replace it with a dimension representing time, so that time is typically the vertical dimension in these models, as the spatial universe, which is represented as a sort of disk, a two-dimensional disk. As it evolves through time, the lines of latitude grow larger and larger as the space expands over time.
Bill, on the first page of this book by Stephen Hawking, he says, philosophy is dead. Now, we've had a lot of fun with that, but I certainly wouldn't want to take him out of context on that. If one were to say that just as is, they're uttering a philosophy and saying, my philosophy is that philosophy is dead. Well, then apparently it's not. But I don't know if he means that. He may mean, well, what does he mean?
Well, Kevin, I think that's what he means. He says here on page 5, traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. So he means to answer traditional philosophical questions like, why is there something rather than nothing, by science rather than philosophy. And I just happened to notice what I had forgotten before. This first chapter in which that paragraph occurs is called The Mystery of Being. So he's not trying to deal with just a scientific question. He is trying to answer a metaphysical question. The mystery of being is a metaphysical question about why is there anything rather than nothing. And that question simply can't be answered on a scientific level because science doesn't handle these sorts of metaphysical issues about why anything at all exists.
Yeah, yet one reviewer on Amazon said that Hawking makes his point quite convincingly. Philosophy is dead in the sense of answering the most mysterious of life's questions. It's up to science and scientific theory to provide clues to the true answers, as philosophy in its most ancient forms has taken a back seat. But modern philosophy, scientific philosophy, has taken root. Now, we've talked about scientism, and I think that's what this reviewer is saying, that scientism is the only way to get answers.
Yeah, this is an expression of scientism, where he says scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery. Scientists are now going to answer these traditional metaphysical questions. And what I would say to that reviewer is that if philosophy is incapable of answering these metaphysical questions, it is absolutely hopeless to think that science could ever answer them, because they're simply not within the purview of science, which is based upon empirical discovery and theorizing, and therefore cannot answer questions about the mystery of being. That is simply not within the purview of science. And you find in the book then, in fact, what the authors do is they misconstrue these philosophical questions, so that instead of answering the question, why is there something rather than nothing, they redefine the word nothing to mean empty space filled with vacuum energy. And then they can explain why the universe exists as a fluctuation of the energy that is contained in empty space. But as one person remarked to me in a quip, he said, what they're not answering is why there's something rather than nothing, but why there is something rather than something else.
Oh, yeah.
And that's quite right. Science can do a good job at explaining the origin of the different phases of the universe as it goes through transitions from, say, a vacuum state to a material state, but it cannot address the metaphysical question of the mystery of being. Why is there anything at all?
Now, his answer to the mystery of being would be what, then?
He doesn't answer it. They redefine the term so as to answer a quite different question. Instead of answering the metaphysical question, why is there something rather than nothing, they redefine the word nothing to mean the quantum vacuum, empty space filled with vacuum energy, and something is then our observable universe, and they answer, how did our observable universe come out of the quantum vacuum? Which is an important scientific point, but it's not the question Leibniz was asking when he asked, why is there something rather than nothing? We want to know, for example, why is there a vacuum filled with energy rather than something else, or rather than nothing at all? And they cannot address these questions. So, in fact, they don't answer the questions that they set themselves out in the beginning of the book. They simply address a different set of questions.
Okay, I want to pause in the action here for just a moment and tell you that there are a few spots left for Israel Tour 2011, hosted by Reasonable Faith and Dr. William Lane Craig. Now, this is in May. If you go to our website, reasonablefaith.org, you'll see full details. This is a fantastic tour. Caesarea, Sea of Galilee, Capernaum. And Dr. Craig is going to be giving some after-dinner presentations, time for questions and answers. And Dr. Craig is going to be lecturing at Hebrew University on Mount Scopus. You have the opportunity to be at that lecture. As you can imagine, this is going to be something. Hebrew University and Dr. Craig's lecture. Now, you can view the full tour dates, the prices, and the full itinerary when you go to reasonablefaith.org and click on Israel Tour 2011. Obviously, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Only a few spots left. Go now to reasonablefaith.org. Hawking says, in the grand design, we explain why. According to quantum theory, the cosmos does not have just a single existence or history, but rather that every possible history of the universe exists simultaneously. I hear this a lot in quantum mechanics and quantum physics. I hear people actually imbue quantum mechanics with almost divine properties, that they can do anything.
Yes.
And the mystery, and if you can't explain something, it's quantum mechanics. It's almost a quantum mechanics of the gap kind of a thing. But and you hear things, Bill, like that a particle takes every conceivable path simultaneously, but yet that's impossible.
What he's referring to there is Richard Feynman's so-called sum over histories move to calculate the probability of a quantum particle which is fired from point A hitting the target at point B. And this is merely a mathematical device for calculating probabilities without running into intractable infinities. Otherwise, you get these infinities that ruin your equations. So using the sum over histories method, it's a mathematical trick where you pretend that the particle takes all possible paths, and then some of these cancel each other out, and you arrive at the most probable point at which the particle will strike the target. But this is nothing more than a mathematical reckoning device. To treat it as a metaphysical picture of reality is a gratuitous piece of metaphysics, which I think scarcely any scientist would take seriously. When I mentioned this in my Defenders class, one of the members of the class is a quantum chemist at Georgia Tech, and he raised his hand and he said, I just can't believe that they would interpret Feynman's sum over histories method to be a literal picture of the way reality is. He says that nobody thinks that. It's just a trick we use for avoiding these infinite quantities. So this is just, as I say, gratuitous metaphysics for which there's no ground at all. But it sounds so impressive because one is invoking the authority of these scientists who are now the torchbearers in our quest for knowledge. But in fact, there's no reason to think that this is a picture of the way reality actually is.
Yeah, it's almost like a God substitute. Quantum mechanics is a God substitute, that when you get to that level, things are, well, frankly, supernatural almost. I mean, but then they don't want it to be supernatural. So
yeah, there's a lot of abuse of quantum physics in theology and philosophy. We've seen that, for example, in the attempt of Eastern religions to appropriate the idea of observer-dependent reality, the Tao of physics that Fritjof Capra wrote of, for example. And these are all, I think, abuses of science, treating mathematical tricks as though they were serious metaphysics, and then taking one physical interpretation of quantum mechanics and saying that this is the true interpretation, when in fact there are something like at least 10 different physical interpretations of the equations of quantum mechanics. They're empirically equivalent. Nobody knows which one, if any of them, is the correct interpretation.
Well, if anybody takes a hard line and starts throwing quantum mechanics at you for some reason, you would say, well, which of the 10 theories do you hold?
Right. I would say, which of the 10 physical interpretations do you think is correct and why?
Yeah.
The second question, at least, is unanswerable.
Yeah. Side road, real quick, Bill. What is shown in the double slit experiment? I've heard about that a lot.
Right. They do a very nice job in the book of explaining a lot of these experiments that are done in quantum mechanics. And in that sense, much of the book I found to be very helpful and beautifully illustrated. And the double slit experiments and other experiments of this sort show that the photons, or the fundamental particles, exhibit behavior that is sometimes wave-like and sometimes particle-like. And so it's a great mystery as to exactly what these fundamental features of reality are really like, because they exhibit the behavior of both light waves, but also of tiny particles.
Now, wave and particle are not the same thing.
No. Right. And yet the fundamental features of quantum physics seem to exhibit the behavior on occasion of both.
Well, does that mean that they're supernatural?
No, it just means that we don't understand their nature. It will depend on the conditions for the experiment, how you measure them, whether or not it exhibits wave-like behavior or it exhibits particle-like behavior, and we don't understand why this is so. But there's no logical contradiction here. It's not as though it is exhibiting both particle behavior and wave behavior in contradictory ways. It depends on the measurement situation, and it's always consistent, but we just don't understand the nature of these fundamental entities, that they would exhibit these different kinds of behavior that we associate exclusively with particles or with waves.
Bill, just from my own observation, it looks like the multiverse and world ensemble type theories are growing rather than waning. Now, for a while, I thought that maybe they would kind of die out as an answer to design and some other things like that. But multiverse seems to be growing in popularity, that there are many universes and we're one of just many.
This is the other theologically significant issue that Mlodinow and Hawking address in the book. The first one would be the beginning of the universe, which we see they affirm that there is an absolute beginning to time and the universe in the no-boundary proposal. The other issue they address is the fine-tuning of the universe. Here it's interesting, Kevin, that they misstate the issue very seriously. They ask, why does the universe have the present laws of physics that it does rather than different laws? And that's not the question that people are asking about fine-tuning. The question we want to know is, why is the universe characterized by the constants and quantities with the values that they have rather than different values of those constants and quantities? And we are talking about other possible universes governed by the same laws of nature, not different laws as they state. Nobody knows what universes governed by different laws of nature would look like. But because we're talking about other universes that are governed by the same laws of nature, but with different values of the constants and quantities, we can figure out what those universes would look like. And Hawking and Mlodinow, again, in the book, do a very nice job of showing how this is done and explaining how if you alter these constants and quantities by utterly trivial amounts, you wind up with life-prohibiting universes. It turns out that our universe is balanced on a razor's edge of incomprehensible fineness in order for the universe to be life-permitting. And the improbability of this occurring is so great, Kevin, that really the only way of rescuing the hypothesis of chance is to go with the multiverse hypothesis or the world ensemble hypothesis, whereby you multiply your probabilistic resources to such an extent that you can guarantee that finely tuned universes like ours will appear by chance somewhere in the ensemble. So
if you have enough universes, the chances are that one of them is going to be this one with these constants.
Right, and in fact, if you say they're an infinite number, then you'll get an infinite number of finely tuned universes just like ours. And so what drives this is not science, frankly. It's a metaphysical proposal to avoid having to posit an intelligent, transcendent, ultra-mundane designer of the cosmos.
We've discussed before in podcast, Bill, it only puts the problem back one step. If there have been many universes, unless you go into an infinite regress and all the things that we talk about in the Kalam Cosmological Argument, well then, was there a first?
Right, that issue still remains on the table, and they're committed to the Hartle-Hawking no-boundary proposal, which says that there is an absolute beginning to time and the universe. Now, the question would be, why think that there is a world ensemble of universes? Why think that there's a multitude of these things? And here, their appeal is to the Feynman sum over histories proposal, that this gives us the many worlds. But as I say, that is just a gratuitous piece of metaphysics that is not in any way intended to give us a number of real, concrete universes. These are just possible paths that the universe could take in order to arrive at the standard model of physics that we observe today. So there's no evidence for such a world ensemble or multiverse that they give in the book, nor do they even respond, Kevin, to the most important critiques of the multiverse hypothesis that have been offered by people like Hawking's erstwhile collaborator, Roger Penrose, at Oxford University. Penrose has said that these multiverse hypotheses are worse than useless with regard to explaining the fine-tuning of the universe, because on these multiverse theories, we ought to be observing a much, much different universe than what we, in fact, observe, so that our observations are really strongly disconfirmatory of the world ensemble or multiverse hypothesis.
I'm a rank amateur at this, and that seems to be the case to me. If anything, it seems like you could shave them off of Occam's razor. And it's kind of bloated to me that you have to have all these bubbles and bangs.
I have to agree with you there. I think that unless you can posit some fundamental, simple mechanism that would pump out these many worlds, then I think you are going to fall prey to Occam's razor because your theory will be vastly more complicated. And nobody knows what this fundamental simple mechanism would be that would pump out these many worlds. In fact, if that mechanism turns out itself to be fine-tuned, then you haven't solved anything. You've only pushed the problem back a notch. And since the theory is as yet undiscovered, nobody knows whether or not that will not itself manifest fine-tuning.
Yeah, well, Robin Collins says that, if you're going to pump out loaves of bread, you have to have a bread maker, in a sense, which would be pretty incredibly fine-tuned.
Well, that will be the question. It remains to be seen, I think. But certainly the fine-tuning that we observe is such that when you try to suppress it in one area, it pops up in another. It's sort of like that wrinkle in the rug where you press it down at one point, it only appears somewhere else. And so trying to eliminate the fine-tuning by making it physically necessary has been futile up to this point, and nobody knows whether or not anyone will be able to find a multiverse theory that is itself free of fine-tuning and doesn't exhibit the same problem.
We've got lots more to discuss on this book and on this topic. Let's pick it up there next time on our next podcast with Dr. William Lane Craig. Thank you so much for joining us, and be sure you go to reasonablefaith.org and see what's new. We'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us on the Reasonable Faith Podcast. Kevin Harris in studio with Dr. William Lane Craig. Bill, we've been talking about Hawking's book, The Grand Design, and we want to spend some more time on this. Check out some of the resources we have at reasonablefaith.org, an interview that you did on this, and some other things as well as a past podcast. But some other issues that Hawking and his co-author bring up in this book, let's discuss that. One of them would be the realism, anti-realism debate. Now, that sounds like a big philosophical question.
Well, it is a philosophical question, Kevin. This is one of the most important questions in the philosophy of science. And it's ironic that in a book, the second paragraph of which pronounces the death of philosophy and says that philosophy is dead and that now it's up to scientists to bear the torch of discovery in the quest for knowledge. It's ironic that the first third of this book would then plunge into a philosophical discussion about realism and anti-realism in science. And for me, this was part of the most interesting sections of the book because they weren't dealing here with fine-tuning or the origin of the universe. It was just straight philosophy of science. And I thought, this is so bizarre. On the one hand, they think philosophy is dead and that scientists are going to answer these questions, and then they find themselves immediately immersed in a profound philosophical discussion. And I thought, don't they understand what they're doing? Don't they realize that they are practicing philosophy? But in any case, that's what the first part of the book is about. About a third of it is on a discussion about realism and anti-realism in science. To what extent do our theories really describe the way the world is? Do they tell us how the world really is, or are they just constructs in our minds that help us get by practically, but they don't really give us any knowledge of the way the world is?
So in a way, you can construct your own reality? Is there an external world?
Well, that's the question that is raised by anti-realism. And although they characterize their theory as what they call model-dependent realism, in fact, Kevin, it's not realism at all. Hawking and Mlodinow are deeply committed to anti-realism about science. They believe that scientific models are simply constructs of the human mind and that they do not tell us about the way the world really is.
Is there a difference between anti-realism and skepticism? I mean, is it that if you're an anti-realist, then it's difficult to get at reality, and so you're skeptical about what you're observing or what you think?
Yes, it would
like
be
that.
Skepticism, at least with respect to the way the world is. Here's what they say on page 7 of their book. They say, if two physical theories or models accurately predict the same events, one cannot be said to be more real than the other. Rather, we are free to use whichever model is most convenient. Now, what's significant about that is that they say that if these two physical theories or models predict the same results, it's not just that we don't know which one is correct and which one is false, but rather that they say one is not more real than the other. It is purely a matter of convenience which one you want to use, and that these are not more or less approximations of reality. These two competing theories, neither of them connect with reality to tell us the way reality really is.
Wow. Didn't Kant bring up some of these issues? You can know some.
Yeah, Kant was an anti-realist. He thought that space and time were constructs of the intellect and that we cannot really know reality as it is in itself, and therefore all we know is reality as it appears to us. And so one way to interpret Hawking and Mlodinow would be as Kantians, that all we know is the world of appearance. We don't know reality as it is in itself. That would be one spin to put on it. And just how seriously they take this, Kevin, is evident on pages 50 and 51 of their book. Let me quote what they say in contrasting young Earth creationism with modern Big Bang cosmology. They say, St. Augustine said that time was a property of the world that God created, and that time did not exist before the creation, which he believed had occurred not that long ago. That is one possible model, which is favored by those who maintain that the account given in Genesis is literally true, even though the world contains fossil and other evidence that makes it look much older. So that's a description of young Earth creationism. The world is not really all that old, even though it contains these various appearances of age, and that's one possible model. They go on to say one can also have a different model in which time continues back 13.7 billion years to the Big Bang. The model that explains the most about our present observations, including the historical and geological evidence, is the best representation we have of the past. The second model can explain the fossil and radioactive records and the fact that we receive light from galaxies millions of light years from us. And so this model, the Big Bang theory, is more useful than the first. Notice he doesn't say more true or more correct than the first. It's more useful than the first. Then they go on to say, still, neither model can be said to be more real than the other.
Wow.
So Big Bang cosmology is on a par with young Earth creationism, in their view, in terms of its approximation to reality, the way the world really is. Neither of these can be said to be more real or more approximately true. All they can be said to be is more useful than the other or more convenient. So this is how radical an anti-realism they have, that these two cosmologists would think that in terms of reality, young Earth creationism, while less useful and convenient, is on a par with their own Big Bang model of the universe. There is no truth about how the universe originated. And what's important for the listener to understand is that when they say that, they do not mean, yes, one is more useful than the other, and we don't know which one is more approximately true. We don't know which one is a better description of reality. That's not what they're saying. They're saying neither of them approximates to reality. They're just models, and neither model can be said to be more real or more correct than the other. This is an anti-realist view of science where all we have are useful constructs, but none of them can be said to be more approximately real or true than another.
That really bothers me.
Oh, it's incredible.
Well, even if you're a staunch anti-realist like that, it's as if even to hold the view, you have to have some backdrop of reality to determine what approximates this most approximates reality, but we don't know. I mean,
You're
know what
making
I mean?
a good point, Kevin.
It's like illusionism. If you think that all is an illusion, you'd have to have a backdrop of reality in order to say this is reality and this is an illusion. So
Yes.
you need something to compare.
Yes.
Now, if you're an anti-realist, there's nothing to even approximate.
And that is why people who are anti-realists, who are philosophers of science, are not anti-realists about everything. They are anti-realist with regard to these very high-level theoretical constructs like quarks or strings or other unobservables of quantum physics. But they're not anti-realists about dinosaurs. For example, they would say that when we postulate dinosaurs as the best explanation for these fossil remains in the earth, we are getting at reality. There really were these animals that once roamed the earth and left these vestiges. That nobody is an anti-realist about dinosaurs. But Hawking and Mlodinow are anti-realists not just about these theoretical entities. They're anti-realists about everything. Listen what they say on page 7. They say, our brains interpret the input from our sensory organs by making a model of the world. When such a model is successful at explaining events, we tend to attribute to it and to the elements and concepts that constitute it the quality of reality or absolute truth. But there may be different ways in which one could model the same physical situation, with each employing different fundamental elements and concepts. And they say when that's the case, one cannot be said to be more real than the other. So they're applying this model not just to high theoretical events in physics, unobservables. They're applying it to all of reality, our observations, everything that we have through the sensory input of our brains. And that runs into the problem that you mentioned. If everything is ultimately illusory and a construct of our minds, then how can you make any sort of objective judgment about what is most convenient, what best makes the predictions, because you have no knowledge of anything? It's all a construction of your mind.
We'll get back to the discussion with Dr. Craig in just a moment, but let me remind you that there are still some spots left for our tour of Israel coming up in May. Israel Tour 2011, hosted by Reasonable Faith and Dr. William Lane Craig. And there are spots left if you'll go there now to reasonablefaith.org. The visits include Caesarea, Mount Carmel, the Sea of Galilee, Capernaum, the Jordan River, the Old City, the Dead Sea, just to name a few. And on select evenings, Dr. Craig will give after-dinner presentations with some time for Q&A. And you'll also have the opportunity to attend Dr. Craig's scheduled lecture at Hebrew University on Mount Scopus. So take a look at the tour dates, the prices, the full itinerary, and registration information at reasonablefaith.org. But you better hurry. What are the theological implications of this? If this view were to take hold, would it play into the hands of naturalism or...
I don't think hard-headed naturalists would want this at all. This is postmodernism, is what this is. This is radical, postmodernist, anti-realism that says we have no knowledge, really, of anything in the world. All we know are our linguistic constructs, and we get along with what works well, but these cannot be said to more or less approximate reality. And it gets even worse, Kevin, because later in the book, Hawking and Mlodinow move from this sort of anti-realism to a kind of ontological relativism, where they say that the model creates its own reality. So it's not, in fact, just a matter of having different models. There are different realities for different people. What this means is that if the model creates its own reality, that for Fred Hoyle, who held to the steady state model, the universe really does exist eternally in a steady state. But for Stephen Hawking, the universe really did begin 13.7 billion years ago. The reality is different from observer to observer. So for the ancient physician Galen, blood really did not circulate through the human body. But for William Harvey, who discovered circulation, blood really does circulate through the human body. So on this view, the model actually creates its own reality, and people with different models literally inhabit different worlds, different realities. This is a radical form of ontological relativity, according to which the world has fallen apart, and there is no objective reality. There is only the reality for me, the world for me, and each observer creates his own reality.
We've been dealing with this for quite some time, that truth is relative, and what's true for you may not be true for me, and you create your own truth and your own reality. And you hear this a lot in popular language. So this tends to kind of reinforce that a little bit. I guess. A
little bit. It is it, Kevin. This is radical, postmodernist, anti-realism, and non-objectivism.
I was trying to be modest. So yeah, it really does reinforce it, doesn't it? Well, that has a certain appeal to people who don't want you to impose your view on them.
Yes.
That's why I think people really like this ontological relativism, moral relativism, truth is relative type thing, because they don't want their Aunt Edna shoving religion down their throat. I mean,
I think that's right. Although I find it odd, because the people to whom the Hawking and Mladenov type appeal is generally your Richard Dawkins new atheist type, who want to get rid of God and believe that God does not exist. But on this theory, for me, God really does exist. He created the Big Bang, and he is just as real as this table. He's as real as I am, for me, on this view, even if for Richard Dawkins, God doesn't exist. So, I mean, think of that. The model creates its own reality. It means that God really exists in some people's model, and he really doesn't in others. And so this would completely undermine the new atheist claim that there is no God. On this view, there is a God, and the young earth creationist is just as much within his rights, believing what he does, as the atheist naturalist is in believing what he does.
Well, we're all just one big happy family. For a book that says philosophy is dead, it sure goes into a lot of philosophy.
Exactly, and that was my overriding point, is that it just exposes the pretentiousness and naivete of that opening paragraph, that it is scientists now who are bearing the torch of discovery. Philosophy is dead. This is pure philosophy, Kevin, and it is amateurish philosophy ultimately.
Yeah. I'm just trying to point out again, and be careful, that because people have accused me of taking him out of context. By when he says philosophy, he means, well, just like this reviewer on Amazon said that we mentioned in another podcast, and that is, it sounds to me, Bill, like they're saying, unless you're wearing a white lab coat in a lab with a test tube, you don't need to be a philosopher. Those are going to be the philosophers. The scientists are the philosophers today, and not a guy who is a non-scientist, but like Alvin Plantinga or yourself, who would write on these subjects. Yeah, but you're not in a lab, and so the scientists are going to be the new or the heroes of philosophy. But philosophy often isn't their field.
No, this is incredibly naive.
See, it is a mess.
It would be one thing to say philosophy is dead, and therefore we're not going to do philosophy. We're just going to look at science. But then you don't plunge into a discussion of realism and anti-realism, which is a philosophical question, not a scientific question. It's a question about science, not a question of science. Then to take positions like ontological pluralism, that our models do not even approximate reality, and then even more radically, ontological relativity, that our models create their own reality. Those are clearly not scientific conclusions, Kevin. There are no experiments that you can perform to demonstrate those conclusions. This is pure metaphysics. And so
a Bunsen burner is not going to help you arrive.
You're talking out of both sides of your mouth when you're claiming to eschew philosophical questions, and then with the other side of your mouth start espousing ontological pluralism, ontological relativity, and postmodernist anti-realism.
Bill, you've also been very fair in your review of the book in saying that there are some helpful things in it as far as illustrating some designs and how it works as well. So what do you recommend about this book?
Well, I would say I would recommend the discussion of quantum physics that is in the center part of the book. It's a very nicely illustrated, nicely explained introduction to the experimental evidence for quantum mechanics. That's to be recommended. I very much second and applaud their discussion of the beginning of time and the origin of the universe. The Hartle-Hawking model, as they interpret it in this book, affirms the absolute beginning of time and the universe. That is the second premise of the Kalam argument. They give a nice discussion of the fine-tuning of the universe and illustrate that. And they affirm that the fine-tuning is real. They say that this is almost miraculous. So in all of those respects, I think the book is very helpful to the natural theologian. And it will be only in these other points of critique that I've offered that one would demur and say that they've been too cavalier in the conclusions that they've tried to draw.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Craig, and thank you who are listening. We really appreciate you being here. Sam Harris, one of the so-called four horsemen of the new atheism, has a new book out on morality. We'll discuss it on the next podcast right here on Reasonable Faith. See you then.